Hi. At the end of the long genealogy of Shem, which we looked at in the last video, amidst a series of obscure names which may be challenging to spell or to pronounce, we find a name that is probably familiar to everybody who would ever be watching this video, and that's at the bottom, Abram, as we see over here. We might not recognize the name of his brothers, Nahor and Haran, who seem to be triplets by the implication of the language here. When Terah lived 70 years, he became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. But we don't hear much about them, and obviously Abram will be the focus as he develops into the name Abraham with his wife Sarai, who later becomes Sarah. It's virtually impossible to come at these stories without some kinds of presuppositions. Just like the other major male characters in the Bible, like Moses, David, or for New Testament readers, Jesus, we all come with certain ideas of what those characters look like, what they acted like, what kind of people they are. And perhaps if we come from an unstudied and unconsidered view of the Bible, we might just consider that all biblical characters are good people and models for human behavior, which is, of course, extrapolating from some Christian understandings of Jesus back into the Hebrew Scriptures. So the first thing we need to do to be looking at these next chapters in Genesis 12 to 25 is explore the various presuppositions that might lead us to think we understand something about Abraham before we actually read the text, to kind of clear the way so that when we enter into the stories we can hear them fresh. And next video we'll look at the structure and themes within these chapters to introduce ourselves into it so we can see the big picture as we begin to explore the details. So I want to start with this quote from Jewish scholar John Levinson, who's written many books on Hebrew Scripture, long professor at Harvard and a dean of biblical studies. And he has this to say around the issue of coming to the study of Abraham. He says, "The claim that Abraham is a source of reconciliation among the three traditions, increasingly called Abrahamic, is as simplistic as it is now widespread. Historically, Abraham has functioned much more as a point of differentiation among the three religious communities than as a node of commonality." And so if we come in with that presupposition, which is very recent but also very common, that's a starting point that we need to look at. As a statistical example of this, I want to bring up a couple of Google Ngram charts. If you're not familiar, Ngram allows you to search for a word or phrase and see what its usage is across the internet over time, or across literature that's in Google search capacity before there was an internet. And so let's look at a couple of these. Here's the occurrence of Abrahamic religions. And as you can see, the term was only developed relatively recently, but it peaked there around 2000 or 2010, I guess it is. Maybe that's around the time of Obama and the question of whether Obama was a Muslim or not, and issues there. It's hard to say whether there's one specific cultural factor. But whether that's that or we see Father Abraham, notice that it's virtually the same curve. So this is a recent theme, and so if it seems it's an idea in your head that Abraham is the father of the three so-called Abrahamic religions, just note that that's a very recent way of looking at it. So what we really need to do is go back to the beginning and see how Abraham was characterized by the earliest people outside the book of Genesis. And to do that, we're going to use the work of a number of scholars who have written surveys of this in recent years. I just want to put their covers up so you can see a few of these. First, from Ronald Hendel, Remembering Abraham, Culture, Memory, and History in the Hebrew Bible, 2005. And then the book from John Levinson that I just quoted, Inheriting Abraham, The Legacy of the Patriarch in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, 2012. And a collection edited by Craig Evans, The Book of Genesis, Composition, Reception, and Interpretation. And that several of the essays in that cover the themes we're looking at here. Jonathan Grossman, Abram to Abraham, a literary analysis of the Abraham narrative, which is more of a study of the text itself, but he has to consider things beyond that, and that's 2016. Then Sean Adams and Domini Lytle editors, Abraham and Jewish and Early Christian Literature, from 2019, just a few years ago. And finally, trying to balance the fact that Abraham is one of two characters that are going to be introduced here, we have Joseph MacDonald Searching for Sarah in the Second Temple era. And beyond those books, there are countless chapters and other books and articles and things. It's a huge scope of literature. I've not read it all. I'm obviously not suggesting that you dig in and read it all, but just a note that many scholars have spent a lot of time, especially in recent years, thinking about this. And perhaps some of that is related to what we see from the Google Ngram, that there's been an uptick in interest in this in a world where world religions are often involved in politics, and whether that's positively or negatively, given hate crimes, etc. So Let's dive into a couple of things to look at how this appears. First, looking just briefly at the text itself. As we noted last time, this 10-generation sequence from Shem to Abram, which echoes then the 10 generations from Adam to Noah. So Abram is placed there in this 10th generation after the flood, parallel to Noah there. That's from within the text, and the end of the genealogy, which we'll look at later, it shifts here. Terah lived 70 years, and unlike the others where it says, and then he lived so many years, had other sons and daughters, and died, it's spread out over several verses, and will actually go down to verse 32 that we'll look at in a couple of videos. So already the structure of this is changing when it gets to Abram, suggesting we're moving out of what scholars have called the primeval history into the family stories. So that's where it sits in our text. But let's look at this list of various ways that scholars have found that Abram is characterized from outside the text, which is to say, often to fulfill the theological or social needs of the authors at their time, making Abraham unmoored from the specific stories we see in the story, or using the stories just as a jumping off point for something else, as we'll see. So one of the most common, and you see it 33 times in the Bible, is this part as Abraham is part of a triad of, quote, founding fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And perhaps some of those are even older than Genesis and the stories of Genesis, and we'll look at some of that later. Perhaps there's some legendary thing of these three people before there are actually stories about them. It's hard to know, but we'll look at some examples of that later. But from within we're going to go from within the Bible to outside the Bible to our current time and seeing how this has developed over time. So as father of his people, and notice I put his people without naming those people, whether those are the quote, Jews or of Judaism, that's a much later understanding. So father of Israel, perhaps. But as we'll see, of course, Abraham is not an Israelite. The very name Israel is another name for his grandson, Jacob. So he can't be a member of a group that only began with his grandson. So that's why his people here is ambiguous. So, and we see that in Deuteronomy 1:8 and then also in Isaiah. A key one often is a recipient of God's covenant, and a couple of examples there from Exodus and Leviticus that Abraham had received the covenant. Of course, that's the covenant of circumcision in chapter 17, and that will be a defining characteristic of the people of God throughout the Hebrew Bible in relation to their neighbors. Another key characteristic, which is controversial to this very day, perhaps even more so than the covenant, is recipient of God's promise of land. And we see that in Ezekiel in a post-exilic text in relation to the people who stayed in the land during the exile, and also in Jeremiah, perhaps writing from the same time period. This theme has become prominent in issues between Israelis and Palestinians in our current day around the question of land in the Middle East. Another theme of Abraham's characterization is one who faithfully obeyed Yahweh. Notice this is different than the New Testament claim from Paul of just expressing something called faith. This is a more Jewish sense of obedience to Yahweh rather than the abstract concept of having faith. And we see that in late texts like Judith and Maccabees. These are not Hebrew texts. These are texts from the Septuagint only. And so that becomes a relatively later thing. And now we're moving outside the biblical era into other texts that were popular in their own day but didn't make the biblical canon. So as an opponent of idolatry, we see that in the Apocalypse of Abraham, one of a series of apocalypses, a so-called Apocalypse of the 12 patriarchs, and then in Genesis Rabbah, which is the Midrash from the rabbis. So in these two Jewish texts, one very thoughtful, reflective, and one in apocalyptic mode, both portray Abraham as an opponent of idolatry, given his root being born in Babylon. And that will play out, of course, not against Babylonian idolatry so much as the local forms of other religion in the land in later periods. Similarly, in relation to that, but more positively, as a student and teacher of Babylonian science and wisdom. And that comes from the much later book of Jubilees, or from Pseudo-Philo, which is probably from the New Testament era or later. And that's at a time when, with the Roman Empire and the power that Jews and whatever else you want to call them at that time were struggling with how much of the culture around them could they embrace without it being contrary to staying a separate people. And so we see that over a number of things. Obviously, Paul will make an issue around circumcision, and there's issues around eating meat and such. But this is around whether you can embrace the science and wisdom of the non-Israelites. And positively, Abraham is presented as someone who not only embraced that, but taught it to others. In a different context, in the book of Enoch, that would be a function of the watchers and would be considered evil. But different times produce different perspectives on things, as we know. From a different perspective, as a friend of God, both in heaven and not, that sense of in heaven, which is not so much a biblical concept, we find it in apocalyptic texts like the Testament of Levi, another one of those testaments of the 12 patriarchs. Of course, in Luke 16, the story of the rich man and Lazarus, when Lazarus, the poor man, is taken into the bosom of Abraham, it doesn't say in heaven, but on the other side, and the Sibylline oracles, which are another set of apocalyptic texts from roughly the New Testament time period and later. So Abraham is portrayed there as someone who's in God's presence interceding for others. If there hadn't been a presupposition of that, of course, Luke couldn't have written a story that presents a dead person going into the bosom of Abraham after death, because there's nothing about that in Hebrew Bible. So wherever Luke got that, it was in the air in that time period. Also in Jubilees, Abraham is presented as a model of Torah-obedient piety and prayer, which had to do with the role of Torah in shaping people as God's people in a post-temple situation. In the absence of the temple and following the rules of the temple about worship, etc., the Torah became the central place of expressing one's faithfulness to the traditions. And so Abraham is often presented here in Jubilees as an example of a model of that. In a little different mode, but in roughly the same time period, the Jewish Platonic philosopher Philo in Alexandria presents Abraham as a model of the Platonic virtue of willingness to be taught. And as I wrote at length, the role of Philo in Empire Baptized and the development of Christianity away from the gospel of Jesus, we see Philo often allegorizing people, so he presents Abraham as an allegorical expression of this virtue, rather than as an actual character in the story. In a slightly different mode, in the Gospel of John, this is a little out of the context, although Philo may well be before the time of John, we see Abraham presented by Jesus as a witness to the Word. Before Abraham was, I am, and Abraham saw my day, longed to see my day, and he saw it. Plainly not to say he saw Jesus, but saw the Logos. So the Jesus of John's Gospel presents Abraham as a witness to the Word from before the time of Jesus. In a very different mode, Paul in Romans 4 and also in Galatians presents Abraham as a model of pre-Torah faith based on Genesis 15:6, the sense that Abraham was justified, or Abram at that point was justified before God before there was a Torah, and that becomes a hinge for Paul to say circumcision is not necessary for the baptized to join the faith community, and that's generated an unbelievable amount of scholarship, including 1,000-page plus commentaries on Romans to debate the points. From an Islamic perspective, and Levinson goes into this in some detail, different from Judaism or Christianity, Abraham is presented as a prophetic predecessor to the Prophet Muhammad. And one of the differences there in Islam, Genesis is not canon. It's not one of their sacred books. So the character of Abraham, Prophet Abraham, is considered a sacred character, but not based on Genesis as a text, as it is in Judaism and Christianity, the religions that develop with the Bible. And then, as I started today, the founder or father of three world religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And as I started off saying from Levinson, that's one that really is not going to work as we entered the story. As he noted, there are more differences based on Abraham than commonalities around those three traditions. So much for versions of Abraham based on the words of text. What if we look at imagery? If we just go to Google and search for Abraham, this is one image of what we see. And I found it fascinating because this is a relatively random set based on Google's algorithm of classical art and then modern things. But I see, in my view, this Abraham looking pretty much the same in most of these, with the long white beard and some kind of turban and some kind of robe like that, even though the book of Genesis never says anything about any of those things. Where the initial image of Abraham looking that way that apparently got copied over time comes from, I'm not sure. But let's do a quick survey of one scene. This is artistic imagery of Abraham meeting the three angels in chapter 18. And as we'll see from these imagery, it may say as much about how artists portray angels over time as how much they portray Abraham. But I thought it might be interesting to just look at a few views of these over time. So here's a Byzantine mosaic from the 540s, and you can see that one there. And I won't comment on each of these except to leave them up for a few seconds so you can see what they look like. Here is from the artist from the 1610s, and then two of them curiously from the same year, 1656, the classic one from Rembrandt on the left, and then the one from Van den Eyck on the right. Then jumping a century to the German context, this one from the 1750s from Plotzer. And then jumping 2 more centuries to the Jewish artist Marc Chagall from 1966, we see this version. And then finally, in our era, from R. Crumb, is Genesis Illustrated in 2009, where he illustrates the entire book of Genesis, a graphic novel. And I'll be bringing up more image of that as we go, because some of you, like me, may be old enough to remember R. Crumb, Mr. Natural, from the hippie days of the 60s and 70s. And this was a work he spent an enormous amount of time on, not what you might expect from somebody who was painting hippies back in the day. So that range of views shows that not only in language and verbal characteristics, but also in art, there tends to be assumptions about what Abraham is about, what he looks like, what he's doing. And the purpose of our engagement in these texts is to be aware of those, but to put them aside so we can begin to hear the text in its detail. So next video, we'll do an overview of these chapters and look at the themes and promises and various elements of how it's structured so that we can enter into chapter 12 and hear the call of Abram after we hear the details that we skipped, we didn't get to yet at the end of chapter 11. See you then. Bye-bye.